Let us understand the idea of macroeconomic equilibrium. So here you have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Notice aggregate supply is upward sloping, and that tells us that it is the short-run aggregate supply that we are talking. And obviously, if we are using the short-run aggregate supply, the equilibrium, which is the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, will give us the actual GDP equilibrium and the price equilibrium or inflation equilibrium in the short run. But we also would know, you probably can see my other videos or maybe even know ahead of time, that the behavior of aggregate supply in the long run is different. And in the long run, aggregate supply curve is a vertical line because the amount of resources is what drives the long run productivity or long run output. And hence, if we assume for the time being that this is where the short run equilibrium is, the long run aggregate supply curve is also intersecting the short run equilibrium, which is your full potential GDP, YF, full potential GDP, is equal to the actual GDP. And so this point becomes both the short run and the long run equilibrium. Now, there is no reason for us to believe that the long run aggregate supply curve will exactly intersect the short run equilibrium. So the long run may be higher or lower. Here we are interested to understand the idea of economic gaps or output gaps. So what is an output gap? It's basically looking at how far is the actual GDP of the country away from its potential. And so when you take a percentage difference, output gap can be represented percent difference in this way. One can then come up with three scenarios. Okay, one could be that we are producing, say, $20 trillion worth of goods and services, and our potential GDP or full employment GDP is greater than the actual GDP that we are producing. So in this case, our actual is below the potential. So in other words, we are witnessing what one can label it as a recessionary gap, whereby we are below the capacity. The second scenario could be that we are at our potential GDP. So full employment GDP is equal to our actual GDP, actual GDP being represented by Y star, and in which case there is no economic gap or output gap. The third case would be whereby our actual GDP is Y star, but our potential GDP is below, or full employment GDP is below the actual GDP that we are producing. So over here we are past our capacity, or we are beyond our capacity, and so there is still a gap in the first case and the third case that we are having, and in the second case we don't have any gap, economic gap or output gap, and this gap in the third scenario is what is known as inflationary gap. You will understand in my other video why we are using the word inflationary. But to understand in reality how realistic is to by we have the actual GDP is below the full capacity, right? So it is very much likely that yes, we are underperforming in terms of our actual production than what we could have had we used all our resources. We could have produced more. Um, in the last scenario where we are having the actual GDP above the potential or full employment GDP, one can start thinking, okay, how can you even produce beyond what you can actually produce given all the resources that we have? So if we use all our resources, then we produce YF, but we are actually producing Y star worth of market value of goods and services in our country. So one might wonder that how is this even possible? Well, if one uses the resources to its full normal capacity, then YF is what we would be using if we use all the resources to its full capacity. But if you overuse any resource, or if you overuse resources in general, then you can produce beyond your full capacity GDP. So of course it's less likely, but it is still possible. And what happens if there is recessionary gap or inflationary gap? We can understand that in a separate video, but we definitely would want to appreciate the fact that the world we live in will typically fluctuate between these conditions. So sometimes we will have a situation where we are below the capacity, sometimes we are just right about at the capacity, and sometimes we exceed the capacity.